Welcome to Regulate Tech with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad, and...
with me, Richard Allan.
So, Richard, we're going to discuss hype, and more specifically, we're going to discuss the Gartner hype cycle. For those of you who have not got the Gartner hype cycle absolutely in your minds, I'm going to describe it for you, and then we'll post a little bit of a picture on the podcast website. So, the hype cycle was introduced in the mid-1990s as a way to visualize the life cycle of emerging technologies. It captures the stages of a technology's adoption from initial innovation to eventual maturity. The curve has 5 phases. First, the innovation trigger, when the technology is actually made or conceived of. Then it quickly accelerates into what is called the peak of inflated expectations. That's when you think the technology will cure cancer, it will help you find alien life. It is going to be one of those technologies that simply revolutionizes everything. It is a transformative thing for humanity. After that, you quickly plummet into what's called a trough of disillusionment, where the technology is not that good at all. In fact, you probably can't even use it to prop up your bed, and you hate it, and you have no faith at all in anyone talking about the technology. As you slowly get up from the trough of disillusionment, you ascend what is called the slope of enlightenment, and ultimately you end up in the plateau of productivity. And the plateau of productivity is that point at which the technology has sort of adapted to our needs, to what the market can do, and also to new uses. So the plateau of productivity is not necessarily just doing whatever we did before, but with the technology, but can actually be transformative. But to get there, you have to get through those 5 phases, and not all technologies do. So, do you have a few examples of technologies that you can see go through this Gartner hype cycle, or generally, do you have thoughts on the hype cycle, Richard?
Yeah, so I think it's quite a good way of how do I describe this? Describing technologies that are not emotive. So I'll just sort of separate that out. So I think traditionally, yes, that's the way. When technology was a mere tool, I think the cycle applies very effectively. I think it's interesting now that with some of the technologies that we're dealing with, they're so people feel so strongly about them that several of the phases can exist simultaneously. So take the one I know well, social media. We went through technology trigger. People invented social media. We went through a peak of inflated expectations, which certainly for sort of Facebook and Twitter might have been the Arab Spring. Social media was seen as the thing that was going to change the world for the better. It was a form of democratizing speech and spreading democracy. We then fell into a trough of disillusionment. People focused on all the negatives that social media could bring. And I think in some ways, from a business point of view, we have been up the slope of enlightenment, or we're at the plateau of productivity. So in some ways, I mean, just factually, social media is key to the way that a lot of businesses get out there and win customers, and is a key part of our economy. It's provided what didn't exist before, which is this thing that people hate, the hyper-targeted advertising. But from a business point of view, where businesses couldn't afford broadcast TV adverts, they've now got a way to reach customers. So arguably, just think about business now, all sorts of small and medium enterprise in particular, through platforms like Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and others, are able now to climb the slope of enlightenment, to be in the plateau of productivity. And yet we still have enormous angst and fear and concern about social media. And so in some ways we're still in the trough of disillusionment. So I just think it's we've ended up with, the highs and the lows all happening simultaneously, rather than it being a linear progression where we all now go, yes, we were disillusioned, but now we're happy with this thing. We're unhappy.
And I think it can certainly be trailing, right? So you're trailing, you have this disillusionment that sort of trails behind you on the slope of alignment, and it keeps trailing as you sort of try to enter the plateau of productivity and taints things. But do you think over time that we'll end up in a situation where we go like, yes, social media is actually, it's just, another kind of media, and just as we don't necessarily, think that other kinds of technologies have that kind of trailing sort of disillusionment, we will become much more neutral about it? Or do you think it will always be part of social media?
I don't know. So I mean, one other response is that technology itself changes in response to the issues that were brought up through the trough of disillusionment. So it's possible. I mean, if I sort of think of the social media landscape, actually take a service that's sort of less controversial would be something like YouTube, where I think, YouTube has revolutionized video watching, if you like. It's commonplace. Lots of people in their homes, they don't have traditional television sets, and they use all kinds of offline media, and the traditional broadcasters are moving into the streaming space. And you could argue that that's the technology that YouTube famously sort of brought out at scale, just the standard video streaming with ads. I mean, all these streaming services look more and more like television because they've all got ad breaks in them. That seems to sort of have got to a place where we are more or less okay with it, and there's still stuff at the edges. But the sort of social media like Twitter, X, and Facebook and Instagram are the ones that are still controversial, where it's still about lots and lots of interaction with each other. I mean, YouTube, in a sense, is largely, I mean, you can call it social media, but it's largely a broadcast mode. It's one to many. Somebody puts up video and it goes out to an audience. They're not spending the whole time kind of going backwards and forwards about that piece of content. The social media where people are going backwards and forwards all the time, it seems to me, is the one that has remained and is sort of hyper personal. That's remained very controversial. And question, will it evolve to become more YouTube-like, to become more of a sort of broadcasty type medium? That would be one way to deal with this. And you could see some of the checks sort of being put in place, that if you join a platform from the outset, you're not allowed, there are criteria before you're allowed to share content. There's criteria before your content will get distributed. So in a way, you're adjusting the product in response to the things that were highlighted as problems during that period of disillusionment.
And I think that's a key point, because I think a lot of transformation happens in the trough of disillusionment for a technology. So I think it's interesting. Arguably, some people could say that YouTube went through the trough of disillusionment and emerged from having been a user-generated content platform to being much more of a media platform writ large. And so it went through a change in terms of the role that it envisioned itself playing in the wider ecosystem. And perhaps the sort of key to the trough of disillusionment is that is where you find your business model. That's where you find sustainable transformation of what the technology can do in some way. And if you can't find that, you will sort of keep being dragged back down into the trough of disillusionment, it seems.
Yeah, it creates all these pressures. I mean, again, interestingly, if we look at that Arab Spring height and then plunge, I mean, the Arab Spring hype was saying, we love the fact that you can use Facebook and Twitter for politics. And you look at the period of disillusionment, it's like, but oh my God, we didn't think it would mean that these people get elected in these countries. And it's very associated with certain outcomes in particular countries. And then the response has been, well, let's downplay politics on our platforms. And so if you went back to the Arab Spring and said, well, we're going to downplay politics. I remember having a conversation with somebody from a government that has a reputation for not being like super pro-democracy, and I remember the regulator saying, your platform is great. People in our country love your platform. It's wonderful, but if you could just stick to it being about Candy Crush and baby photos and keep all the politics off, we'd be fine. And that was at the time. It's like, you're ridiculous. We're all about politics. They'd looked at the Arab Spring and their conclusion was, please keep the politics off. Actually, what we've seen over time, that slope of enlightenment has been quite a lot of pressure from all sides to kind of downplay the politics on social media. And I think perhaps there's a majority view. Certainly if you talk to the users of the platforms, they will say, similarly, can we have baby pics and Candy Crush, but less politics, please? So so it's sometimes surprising, that transformation. You're right, it happens in response, but the transformation itself can then also perhaps cause another sort of trough of disillusionment, as people say, but I don't like the new bit. What do you mean you've taken the politics off? Shock horror. So we can go through these multiple cycles.
And sometimes you don't even come out of the trough of disillusionment. I think it's true for many technologies. I mean, I remember the late 1990s when we were very much up in arms and very enthusiastic and bombastic about things like push technology that had a lot of peak expectations. It would sort of replace the internet, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it then disappeared into the trough of disillusionment, never to be seen again, which is also the fate of some technologies. Now, we want to sort of do this a little bit as a craft episode. And so one of the things I want to ask you is, okay, you are a public policy professional. You have been hired by a company that is just heading into the peak of inflated expectations. And the founder, everyone, they're raising money. They're asking you to sort of show how enormously politically important this technology is. And you know in your heart of hearts that formulating public policy strategy based on the peak of inflated expectations not going to be great. You would rather go for the platform of productivity. How do you deal with that? And should you sort of what do you do in terms of response to the attraction of that peak of inflated expectations?
Yeah. I think if you can be far-sighted enough to try and see all these phases and make a reasonable prediction about where they're going to go, you're probably going to make most of the decisions. You're right that the temptation is you want to go and engage with the governments and encourage them to come up with their regulatory framework when you're at that peak. And that's a huge risk. And then you'll make decisions. Again, I work for a platform that saw the peak of excitement about the platform being a democratizing force and said, what we need to do is invest massively in showing how relevant we are for politics. And that arguably then led to the position that we were later found ourselves in, where people said, what the hell are you doing interfering in politics? You're a private company. You've got no right to be doing this. And so in a sense that, we took a decision at the peak that we later, I'd say, came to regret. It came back to bite us. So I think the place where you want regulation to be settled or the position to be fixed, I think is on that slope of enlightenment. So it helps to shape the plateau, which is where you want to end up. I think the two worst places are at the peak, although it doesn't feel bad. It feels like a good place. Everybody loves us. Let's get the regulation done now where everybody loves us. It feels good, but is a siren's call. You're being summoned onto the rocks and your ship will founder if you follow that siren's call. And the risk is most regulation, I think, tends to be framed in that trough of disillusionment. So the policymakers often actually a bit, because they believed in the hype, when everything crashes, that's when they're most focused on the whatever the technology
and
is.
also because of the actual the time span of legislative processes. Yeah. If you start on the peak of inflation, in most cases, you're almost guaranteed to have the regulation be formulated and then set in the trough of disillusionment, right?
Exactly. So it's partly that timing, but also I think there is just we've all seen this. There's a swathe of people that will come in policy terms to fix it. I'm a politician, so I know what this is like, but it's like, your job as a politician is to fix the bad things that are happening. And so there's just a natural instinct when there is a trough of disillusionment to say, oh my God, this technology is doing this terrible thing. I'm now going to come in and fix that. That's just an instinct. So you get a broader range of politicians than the ones who are interested at the peak. You'll get some politicians interested. I love this new technology. So you get perhaps more the technophile politicians who will be engaged at that peak of excitement, the peak of the hype. In the trough of disillusionment, you'll get a broader range, I think, of general politicians who just see their role quite correctly. It's not to be dismissive. Their role is to legislate to protect people from the bad things that are happening. And almost by definition, that role is going to be more closely associated with times of disillusionment when people are complaining that bad things are happening.
So to some degree, you can also say that if you look at how well do we know a technology, how well do we understand it, you can say the 2 points at which we understand it the least are at the peak of inflated expectations and at the trough of disillusionment. Because at those 2 points, we sort of just see one aspect of the technology, its potential or perhaps its harm. So what are the things you can do if you really truly believe that the slope of enlightenment is the best place to regulate? How should you approach this? And let's take an example. How do you think that crypto companies could have done better?
Yeah, so I think it is playing that long game. So you're right. So crypto's been in that. It's been in both, hasn't it? With sort of the FTX thing, and actually, I think the population is still, or the population, the general. I don't mean the general population. I mean the population of sort of policy interested people are still quite divided. There's still quite a few hypers, and there's still quite a few sort of disillusionment folks. So that community is in those two spaces. How I would do it differently, this would apply to crypto or anything else. I think if you understand what your end game is, and your end game is a steady state plateau of productivity. So your end game for crypto is not that you're going to destroy the banks and revolutionize the financial system, and that's not that's not like a
And it
serious
also
sustainable
creates
end game.
individual sovereignty because everyone will be their own currency, for example.
Yeah. And I'm just going to, I'm going to the government to go, please get behind me. I've got this thing going that's totally going to destroy, not, again, from the government point, it's going to destroy your power and authority. Well, that's bad enough. It's going to destroy your power and authority and create a society which you probably don't want, because it's one in which people like me have the power and authority because we control the crypto. Whatever we say, it's us who control. So all your messaging is wrong. So I would say what is your steady state that you're aiming for, and keep your eye on that. And you might need to adjust it over time, but where are you actually trying to get to? Just to give you another one, there's sort of like not an internet one, but electric vehicles. Again, you can see we're going through that cycle in electric vehicles. And look, I can see the steady state is electric vehicles technically are better than the petrol and diesel ones they're replacing. It's just seems to me like a fact. We're going to get there eventually, but for a lot of people, that transition is quite challenging because they live in rural areas with large distances, et cetera, et cetera. There's all sorts of practical things to get there. But the hype and the disillusionment bits are saying, oh, we could all have electric vehicles tomorrow and there are no problems. Or the disillusionment bit says they'll never take off, because they'll never be good enough for everybody, or they're worse than the petrol and diesel vehicles. So if I'm working on which I do sometimes, I spend time trying to help an organization that's advocating for electric vehicles, so I'm not neutral on it. But I think there you're focused on the steady state, which is, let's all agree we'd like to replace the polluting vehicles on our streets with this better technology. Let's be sensible about how we get there, up the slope of enlightenment. But let's not sort of fall into either of these extremes of overselling or trashing something. And crypto, come back to crypto, I think is either being oversold or it's being trashed. I don't know what the equivalent of the electric vehicles scenario is for crypto, what that steady state is where it has a role to play in the financial system, but isn't destroying everything in its path.
Yes, and I mean, I tend to think I have this hypothesis where I think that both at the peak of inflated expectations and in the trough of disillusionment, you can really easily discern that you're there, because what you're talking about in both those cases is your main subject, the sort of the unit of analysis is the technology. So the technology will set you free, or the technology is horrible and will have all kinds of harms. But if you think about what the plateau of productivity looks like, you're actually talking about people using the technology to a much larger degree, which means that you're shifting from having the technology be the main persona or the protagonist of the story to the people using the technology be the protagonist of the story. So if you want to aim for that, the best thing you can do, especially as you sense that you're heading into this trough of disillusionment, is to start to find people who are using the technology for sensible things and have them take main stage. That seems to me to be the better way to modulate it. Even if you're in the trough of disillusionment, those stories will still resonate because they're not about the technology being all transformative or the technology being horrible. They're about people doing something. And I think that's something that is super hard to do. But I think if you manage to do it, I think that could probably be a way to try to accelerate the time it takes you to get up onto the slope of enlightenment.
I think that is the most important observation. Actually, it's about the users. Stupid. It's about the people that use technology. Because you're right. In both those early phases, there's something about a sort of technological deterministic view. Social media will make us all into Democrats, small d Democrats. We might have lived in a despotic country, but now we've become democratic because social media made us democratic. or social media will make us all into terrible people. We were previously all sort of sane and well balanced, and now we've become political extremists. So those are both technologically deterministic, one in the peak of the hype and one in the trough of the disillusionment. I think neither are correct. And you're absolutely right. If you can focus on what people are going to do with the technology, what people need from the technology, what is it answering? How is it going to help people? Then I think you can end up with this much more balanced position. And it's when you lose sight of that you get in trouble. And actually, from a regulatory point of view, you end up with regulation that acts against the public interest, because it's taken this technologically deterministic point of view. We must regulate to stop the technology doing something before you even understand whether the people want the thing that's be done. Data protection law, there's some aspects in there of where potentially, or the current AI debate, where potentially the regulation is preventing people from accessing things that we don't know that they don't want. If I can use lots of negatives, that there may be some they're actually quite comfortable with, but the regulation is preempting, is making assumptions about the technology being harmful, rather than really understanding whether or not the public, which the regulation is designed to serve, would in fact rather have that technology and take the risks, if there are any risks associated with it.
And generally, I mean, this is I think what people tried to get at when they talked about technology neutral regulation, which was that we should be regulating uses and not the technology itself. Now that has been poo-pooed, because the idea has been that no technology is actually really neutral, which is of course true. But I do believe that if you check your sentence structure and the subject that you're using in every sentence is the technology rather than the users of the technology, then that's a fairly surefire way of telling if you're in the trough of disillusionment or the peak of inflated expectations, and not aiming at that plateau of productivity. I mean, I think it's one of the things that if you can early on to do one of those time travel thought experiments, what you should do is to say, okay, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that this technology makes it through the hype cycle. We end up on the plateau of productivity. Who are the people then using it? And can I go talk to them now? And if I can go talk to them now, can they then become character witnesses for the technology? Can I use them? Can I work with them in order to craft that story? Because what you do then is you create a little bit of an attraction point at that plateau of productivity. So there is a way to get up the slope of enlightenment. The slope of enlightenment is slippery. So if you can find like an anchor point on the productivity plateau, you can get up much faster. Otherwise, you risk always slipping down into the trough of disillusionment again, I think. And now I do think the analogy police is going to
we're done for. But I think within that, what's really important is focusing on what ordinary people are going to do with the technology. Because again, the risk is technology early adopters are often atypical from the standard uses, and we make a lot of case studies around that. And I remember doing it at work. You would end up. Again, I think sometimes particularly you kind of make enemies, because what you do is you champion these early adopters who often are challenging to incumbents. And your plateau of productivity is when the incumbents when the banks are using crypto, when the big media companies are using online video distribution. That's your plateau of productivity. The risk is in those early phases, all you're doing is talking about, we're going to put the BBC out of business and put the banks out of business. And all our champions, our case studies are these people who are so much better than the dinosaurs, even that language, we deal with the dinosaurs. And that's not helpful. Or, our power social media users, not your typical person, how they're going to use it. So I think, again, if you can think ahead to say, assuming we're successful and assuming our technology becomes embedded, how are those people going to use it? How are all of the people who live in rural areas going to use the EVs? And what do we need to make electric vehicles work for them? Not the power EV champion in the rural area, in the urban area, who's just like me. But how do we get there? How do we predict ahead to those people? And it is really hard, because particularly when you're in the hype cycle, all the people you're surrounded by are these early adopters who are they start to look typical to you. You forget how atypical they are.
That's an excellent point. I agree with that very much. I think the other thing I think it's worthwhile to address here, not to sort of leave people with any misconceptions, is that hype isn't necessarily bad. I think hype has a role to play for two reasons. One is I think a hype technology gets explored much faster by people. So they test it, to do different things with it, etc. And they try to do all these things within the peak of inflated expectations. And when they can't, they sort of fall into the trough of disillusionment, where again, a lot of learning happens. So those first two phases aren't actually bad. It's not as if you should avoid them. You could imagine telling somebody who's sort of engaged in this that what you should do is that you should try to kill the hype. Every meeting you go into, you should try to sort of stop the hype. That's not going to work. Partly because your marketing department is going to feed the hype, and partly because your founders might actually need the hype in order to raise new capital, etc. The hype has a function. So it's not so much resisting it as trying to see beyond it and trying to figure out, okay, what is the message that I can start seeding now that will allow me to deal with the fact that I know that at some point we are going to plummet into that trough of disillusionment, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think particularly for the policy teams, because I mean, the product teams, they'll often cycle. So you'll get people in that early phase and they'll build up the hype. And you're right, they go out and they do the pitches and they bring in all the money. And maybe they'll move on as you sort of move and you want different product manager type skills and you want to become more serious. And the product cycles can often be very quick. But the policy cycle is longer, so you'll often end up with the policymakers that you're dealing with being with you throughout the whole period, and that's quite different. If product people are working on like 3-month or 6-month release cycles, legislation works on a 3-year or 5-year release cycle, and so you're working to this very different timeline. And so we do need to think sort of very carefully about that and how you benefit from the hype period to make friends, maybe how you try not to lose those friends when things get tougher. And when these new people come in who are now very negative about your technology, how do you engage with them? And then how do we work with people to get to a good place in terms of that slope of enlightenment and eventual steady state?
Yeah, it doesn't harm you if you know that somebody's going to be with you through the entire curve to sort of hint at the plateau of productivity being the ultimate goal. Yeah. And sort of recognizing the hype and saying there's a lot of enthusiasm around technology, it has a lot of potential, we're exploring it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we think that the plateau of productivity is where we're heading. And because that sets people up also not to feel disappointed. The danger, of course, is if you push into the peak of inflated expectation and you bring everyone with you, they will also experience the fall into the trough of disillusionment. So there's like this really interesting stakeholder management question of how you keep people enthusiastic and engaged while not setting them up for a fall.
That's really important to be thinking that through. And there is a risk, and I've seen it, and I'm probably guilty of it, because this is a podcast in which we talk about the things we're guilty of.
Partly therapy, partly podcast, frankly. It's like,
yes. But part of that is in that peak of expectations, you make friends. And then you find that your people are now asking questions and these other politicians are coming in who are negative. It's like tempting to hang out with the positive people and ignore the negative ones. And it's a human instinct to do that. But that does mean, well, I can just ignore those people. They're just noises off, bitching about my technology. I've got these friends. Actually, as you get into that trough of disillusionment, you'll find your friends want to spend less and less time with you. And you've spent no time on your new enemies, who could turn out to be actually quite constructive, particularly if you are going to adjust the product and you're going to work with them. But you can make the mistake of finding yourself, having lost your original set of friends, but having also alienated the new people who've come in as critics.
I think that's true, but you have to be so discerning, because there is this thing that we could call disillusionment opinion entrepreneurs who are so they live and make a living in the trough. I love it, because
Yeah.
that's the point at which they can exploit people's sort of sense that, I should have known better, I feel disappointed in myself, etc. So those people who sort of thrive in the trough, they are also easy to over-index on. And I do think that there's sometimes this happens where there's this I think healthy sentiment within a company where it says we should really talk to our critics, and you end up talking to the people who have no intention whatsoever to ever scale the slope of enlightenment, because they like it quite nicely in the trough. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so you've got to get the balance right. But I love that phrase you used, Nick. I want to hear it again. So I think you just described opposition politicians perfectly, because that's essentially what you have to do in opposition. Was it a disillusionment entrepreneur? You're
Disillusionment opinion entrepreneur. Yeah,
opinion entrepreneur. Like
that's
that is an opposition politician. Yeah, you're constantly unhappy with the government and everything that they've done. Yeah. And some of those people, actually, to your point, there, they fail to translate into government. So often oppositions, when they get into government, because they're so used to it, it's like, hang on a minute, you've actually got to run things and defend them now. And oh dear.
Yes, that is very hard. Okay, that's brilliant. I think so. Generally on hype, then, I mean, if we are leaving people with a few thoughts here, I think it's to not resist the hype cycle, because it does have a certain determinism to it, but actually understand it and then set your targets right. You're going to have to go through the peak of inflated expectations. You're probably going to have to go through the trough of disillusionment. But if you keep the plateau of productivity in mind, and you grow your stakeholders, your messaging, etc., from that standpoint, if you use that sort of point of the circle and work backwards to what you want to accomplish, you're going to be much better off than if you lean into the peak of inflated expectations and sort of drink too much of the Kool-Aid and believe that your technology is truly going to cure cancer and fix climate change and do all those wonderful, wonderful things that we all want to do.
Exactly. Unless you are working on technology that cures cancer, in which case you're allowed to have those inflated expectations, or
even required to. Actually, I think that's a fair point. It's an actual fair point. Okay, that's very good. Well, thank you so much for listening. And we certainly are not overhyped, but actually, I think we're sort of constantly living quite satisfied in the trough of disillusionment, and bringing you news from there, so that we can all scale the slope of enlightenment together to reach that golden plateau of productivity. Thanks so much for listening, and hope to have you with us next time.